Good evening to you all and welcome to another episode of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Andrew de Blocq, and I'm streaming to you live from Johannesburg, South Africa. And I apologize if you can hear the generator in the background. Unfortunately, at about 22, we were hit with load shedding here in Johannesburg, and there was some panic stations with my fellow panelists making sure that we were all going to be on board and online, but it's all worked out okay. We're getting going at exactly 7 o'clock. So welcome to you all. So great to see so many people in the audience, and I see it's filling up quickly. So welcome to everyone tonight. So tonight, I'm sincerely hoping that you do not get sick of seeing my face, as I'm both hosting and presenting this evening. But the good news is that I am joined tonight by three much more interesting personalities and also much more experienced birders in Dr. Callan Cohen, Etienne Marais, and Vincent Ward. Tonight, we're tackling a rather heavy topic, but also one of the more important ones I think we've covered on Conservation Conversations, that of ethical birding. However, before we get into this tonight, I'll first get into a few announcements and some housekeeping. So if you'd like to communicate with us this evening, please use the Zoom chat room. And remember to select all panelists and attendees if you want everyone listening to see your message. Please ask your questions of the speaker by using the Q&A box throughout the webinar. If you're watching us on Facebook Live tonight, you can also use the comment feed on Facebook for your comments and questions. Our speakers will get to these at the end of our panel discussion, and I'm sure that is going to be a lively one tonight. We do love hearing from all of you, so please do let us know which channels you're using to tune in and use the hashtag Conservation Conversations. If you've missed out on any of our previous episodes, you can catch up with the recordings on the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel, or you can listen to them via our podcast, available on all major streaming services. We'd like to encourage all of you listening to please visit our YouTube channel and click the subscribe button, which will help us to grow support for our webinar content. Now, thank you again to those who continue to generously donate towards the production of these webinars using the Cricket Donations platform. You can simply scan the QR code if you'd like to donate using your phone camera, or you can visit the Conservation Conversations webpage to find the link to the donations portal there. Your contributions help us to keep these talks free for all of us to learn and enjoy. Now, Outliers Coffee are roasting for a cause in support of BirdLife South Africa's landscape conservation program and the work we do to conserve our most threatened birds and habitats in South Africa. Get your very own Dawn Chorus coffee as grounds or whole beans in 250 gram or 1 kilogram packets online today. And you can see the link on the site now. And enjoy the fresh, delicious kickstart to your day that every early birder needs. Proceeds from these sales will go to our conservation work, and we encourage all of our viewers watching to buy their own Dawn Chorus from Outliers Coffee today. It's certainly the way that I like to start every day at the office or in the field, in fact. Now, BirdLife South Africa's 5th virtual Learn About Birds, or LAB conference, will run on the 27th and 28th of May 2021 through the Zoom platform. The deadline for early bird registrations, which are cheaper than the standard registrations, will close on the 31st of March 2021. So you've only got about 2 weeks to make use of that offer. Registrations can be carried out through the BirdLife South Africa website on screen now. There will also be a dedicated science lab taking place from 8:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon on each day, and this will be followed by 2 layman's lectures in the evenings at 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock. You can either register for both events if you enjoy these webinars and are more interested in the layman's lectures. You can also register to just attend the layman's lab in the evenings. To find out more and to register and pay for this event, please visit the BirdLife South Africa website, or you can email lab2021@birdlife.org.za. Our 2021 AGM is also going virtual this year and will be held on the 29th of May. To register for this important event, please visit the Blocq page under the events tab on our website, or you can email flock2021@birdlife.org.za. There are still a few places on our joint Chobe River trips with CNP Safaris. These trips are available at a heavily discounted rate and are relevant to everyone from the general wildlife enthusiast to the expert birder and photographers. Please email the address on screen now for more information, and note that some of the proceeds from these trips will come to BirdLife South Africa and support our work. Now, BirdLife South Africa is very excited to announce that the Cycle in the Bush our annual mountain bike fundraising event is back. Together with Escape Cycle Tours and Abelana Game Reserve, we're pleased to invite you to join internationally renowned commentator Phil Liggett on a 3-day adventure in the gorgeous Abelana Game Reserve in the Greater Kruger region. This is your chance to be part of an exciting and memorable event with the voice of cycling, Phil Liggett. We've managed to secure a really great deal this year, so come join us for some great cycling and soul-restoring time in the wilderness from Friday the 24th of September to Monday the 27th of September 2021. You can contact Lindsay Smith. Her email address is lindsay.smith@birdlife.org.za. That's Lindsay with an E, for more information and to book your spot. Yet another exciting announcement this week is that bookings are once again open for our once-in-a-lifetime Blocq to Marais trip in January 2022. You can join 2,000 other birders on board a cruise ship on an expedition to South Africa's Southern Ocean islands. There are over 70 possible seabird species to see on this trip, with nearly 20 seals and cetaceans as well. A team of over 40 expert guides will be on board, and very importantly, your bookings will contribute to BirdLife South Africa's work, in particular, our Saving Marian Islands Seabirds project. We would like to remind you to join the South Africa Listers Club, hashtag proudly South African community of birders that have ticked 300 or more species in our diverse country. Joining is as simple as typing your name, hometown, and total into the form on the South Africa Listers Club webpage on screen now, which can also be accessed via the Go Birding tab on our website. If you're already a member of the Listers Club, remember to update your total regularly via the same link. So tonight I have the distinct dishonor of having to introduce myself. The regular Conservation Conversations viewers are likely familiar with me by now, but for those of you who are not, my name is Andrew de Blocq, and I am the Avitourism Project Manager at BirdLife South Africa. As part of my role, I manage the Community Bird Guide project, our birder-friendly establishments and tour operator networks, the provincial birding routes, and I also administrate the South Africa Listers Club. In what feels like a previous life, I graduated an MSc from the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at UCT, with my thesis focusing on the effects of boat-based tourism on waterbirds. Within my thesis, I published a set of scientifically informed management guidelines for responsible and eco-friendly boat tours, taking the bird's distribution, behavior, and conservation status into account. Now, with that experience in mind, I'm very excited to lead tonight's talk, in which we'll be delving into the topic of ethical birding. Okay, you should all be able to see my screen, and I'm going to kick off. So tonight we're talking about ethical birding. As I said in my introduction, I mentioned that this is quite a heavy topic. There is really a lot of ground to cover, and I don't expect that we're going to get through all of it tonight, but I thought it was useful just to frame this discussion a little bit, bring it into a bit of a narrower and more relevant context for us to have this discussion this evening. So essentially the background to tonight's discussion is framed by the South Africa Listers Club. So the South Africa Listers Club is just over a year old. It was launched in February last year, and it has just over 350 members now in just over a year, which I think is quite impressive. It's growing on the daily basis. So the South Africa Listers Club is, as I said in the introduction as well, for anyone who's seen more than 300 species in South Africa. Now, the key word there is seen. So there was a big debate recently online on a particular Facebook thread that was discussing the effects of disturbance of birders on some sensitive species, particularly those that are breeding or living in sensitive habitats. Now, the reason this debate flared up is because there was an amazing discovery made in the wider Gauteng area of a couple of rallid species, which are very, very threatened, but also very secretive and very rare in South Africa, especially within striking distance of a major metro. So there was a debate that flared up about people going in and potentially disturbing these birds in order to get a record. And of course, with the special nature of these birds, there was bound to be hundreds of birders that descended onto the site. So this discussion is taking place in a rather urgent and topical context. The club itself is set up as more of a celebration of birds. Of course, there is a leaderboard. No listing club would be complete without one. But the idea is not to be competitive to the extent that it is to the detriment of our birds. This club is very much about celebrating the amazing natural heritage that we have as South Africans, that we're very lucky to have on our doorstep, and also sharing this with a like-minded community. So BirdLife South Africa, in the context of this recent discovery, had a decision to make around our rule of only having seen birds counting for our lists. There was a strong argument coming through on social media from some proponents that perhaps we should be considering, especially for these sensitive and secretive species, allowing a herd-only approach. So this is quite a change to the existing BirdLife South Africa, or the birding culture in South Africa, I should say. So we put together a framework in which to make this decision. So first and foremost, we have to be guided by our morals and principles as an organization. So BirdLife South Africa, as the host of the South Africa Listers Club, is a conservation-focused organization. So we were guided by our vision and our mission in this instance. Our vision, I'm just going to read them through for those who are not familiar, is BirdLife South Africa wishes to see a country and region where nature and people live in greater harmony, more equitably and sustainably. And then our mission is that BirdLife South Africa strives to conserve birds, their habitats and biodiversity through scientifically based programs, through supporting the sustainable and equitable use of natural resources, and by encouraging people to enjoy and value nature. So clearly, encouraging people to enjoy and value nature is exactly why we set up the South Africa Listers Club. And in our vision, you can see there's an element of harmony, an element of non-disturbance there. So we were very much guided by that in our decision making, but also our birding code of ethics, which we published a few years ago, and is the guiding principle for birders in South Africa on how to behave ethically and correctly when out birding. So we consulted both of these guiding principles as they are, and we asked around our senior management and some important stakeholders, some of the more prominent members of the South Africa Listers Club, and we came to a decision that we will allow birds that are only heard onto our list. The main reason for this is that when a birder is out and they hear a very secretive bird or one that lives in a very sensitive habitat, the temptation, if you have to get a visual to see the bird, is to barge in there, disturb the bird, cause potential damage to the habitat and the bird, and you're not sure if that bird's breeding or what its body condition is or its context or anything like that. So in that approach, hearing the bird, especially for these birds that live in secretive habitats, they generally have rather iconic calls. So hearing the bird is a very important way of experiencing the species. So in this case, it's a lot more conservation oriented to happily tick the bird, acknowledge that you're in its presence, enjoy that privilege, and then move on, and hope that maybe one day you'll be able to see it. But we felt that making this option available in the South Africa Listers Club provided those who would like to take an approach that lessens their disturbance on the environment, and it gives them that option if they would like it. So by no means are we forcing anyone to take up this philosophy, but we did think it was an important move from our part as a conservation organization who's concerned with the welfare and conservation of birds and their habitats, to make this option available to birders. We do hope that this move makes people think about the effect that they have on the environment, and whether or not they take up herd-onlys on their personal lists, that's totally up to them. But it is an option that is out there and is, I think, in the best interests of birds and conservation. So we're therefore pretty comfortable with this decision. We understand there will be a little bit of backlash, and I'll deal with some of the comments that I've heard in just a second. It's important to note as well that this move brings us in line with a lot of international birding organizations and other listing clubs and platforms, and we're going to talk about this in a panel discussion in just a second. So what does this mean, this move, for us as birders in South Africa? Well, publicly, the feedback to this decision when we announced it just last Friday has been overwhelmingly positive. Many birders are very grateful for this opportunity to lessen their disturbance, not only when they're ticking off a lifer, but also in general birding. And people seem to grasp the conservation issues at hand, especially for sensitive and secretive species. However, in private, I have received a few disgruntled messages from friends and other birders who do not support the decision. Many birders are not convinced that hearing a bird counts as having experienced it and are therefore uncomfortable ticking a bird that they've only heard. Well, we're going to deal with that a little bit later, but my answer here is that nobody, and definitely not BirdLife South Africa, is forcing anyone to tick birds that they only hear. Your list is your list at the end of the day, and if you set yourself different criteria, then that's absolutely your prerogative. We would ask you tonight to really consider, while we're discussing these issues, why you make that distinction and what the consequences are for birds' welfare and conservation as a result. For those birders out there who are concerned about the birds that they encounter and enjoy, this is one way for them to lessen their disturbance and their impact. There also seem to be concerns that other birders might falsely claim birds on their list, or this may create an opportunity for others to overtake them on the listing club. So firstly, to deal with the idea of false claims, I think there is as much scope for people to falsely ID a bird as with a visual as there is with a call. So that hasn't really changed at all. And also the South Africa Listers Club is not set up, as I said, to be detrimental to the point of it's not set up to be competitive to the point of being detrimental to the birds that we so love at BirdLife South Africa and that we work to conserve. So that's not really the ethos of the South Africa Listers Club, and we do encourage people to be guided by our birding code of ethics when they are signing up for this club. So why do we need to talk about ethics tonight? Let's get into the meat of this presentation. So there's a couple of factors, and I'm going to go through them very quickly because we're going to flesh them out with other people's opinions, and you can stop listening to me for a while in just a second. But we have an increasing number of birders putting pressure on the environment, an increasing availability of technology in terms of birding apps, portable speakers, cameras, and social media, each of which contributes to the potential damage that birders can cause to birds in the environment. Many people are also unawares of the impacts, and I'm hoping that each of us goes away with a fresh take on things tonight. And of course, there's also proliferation of competitively driven birding, which we're going to deal with that mindset in just a second. So what is unethical birding? It's a really, well, what is ethical birding is a really big question, but I thought it was an easier approach to flip it on its head and say, what is unethical birding? And I would say that's birding that has a lack of consideration and care for, number one, the birds themselves, number two, the environment in which you find yourself, and number three, other birders. So birding should be the environmentally friendly hobby that it's perceived as. I think we have this reputation of being very green, bunny-hugging people in the birding community. But with these different factors that I've just mentioned coming into play, certainly there's scope for some birders to do damage in the environment. So it's important, I think, that we have this discussion tonight. Some problematic behaviors, I will whiz through these as well. These can incorporate playing playback or playing tape for those of you who actually used to use tape to play your bird calls. These days it's mostly done via apps that everyone can access. And this is mainly concerning because of the volume at which people use playback, the duration, some people use it incessantly, and also the context, using it, for example, in the presence of a breeding bird. Then there's also physical disturbance, people actually coming into close proximity with birds. This can cause trampling and habitat destruction, especially in wetlands and other sensitive habitats. It can cause physiological effects for the birds, and this was something I studied in my master's around behavioral responses. It can cause real stress, even if the bird seems not to be too perplexed at you being there. It can have these underlying physiological effects that you cannot see in its behavior. And then also flushing birds in both senses of organized flushes, but also causing a bird to flee from its current location can be called flushing a bird. And that can have some negative consequences, again, in the example of a breeding bird leaving the nest open for predation. And there's some very well documented cases of that happening. Then there's also trespassing and ignoring local rules, which we should all be abiding by at all times. Also respecting the local wishes of the property owners. Then also handling birds without the proper training and without proper cause to handle birds. If you're doing research and you're trained, perhaps you can handle a bird ethically. And if you're perhaps rescuing it from a dangerous situation and taking it to a rehab center, for instance, then maybe handling a bird is ethical. Otherwise, I think we would argue that mostly you should try and avoid that. and then also disrespecting the greater environment, whether that's littering, picking plants, or driving off-road and causing unnecessary erosion and damage to the local veld. And then some other considerations before we get into it. We need to take into account the bird's condition. I've already mentioned breeding birds, but also molting birds, especially molting water birds, can be under severe stress levels and have compromised body condition, which puts them at risk. We need to watch our bird hide behavior. We need to watch the distance at which we approach birds, giving them a respectful distance at all times and making sure that they're not showing any stress behaviors. We need to watch our attitude towards other birders. This is applicable both when out birding, so I mentioned hide etiquette just now, but also at a birding site or at a bird sighting in particular, making sure that you're taking other birders' needs into account and you're being respectful and kind, but also online. Unfortunately, the birding community being made up of the flawed humans that we are, there's a certain amount of animosity that flares up, and I think we as birders need to realize that we are a community and treat each other fairly and kindly. And lastly, there's one that flared up recently, interference in predation events. Generally, I think the approach is that you should let nature take its course. I know it can be difficult in some instances, whether it's a bird predating on another animal or something eating a bird. Generally, the best approach is to let nature unfold, as difficult as that might be. So back to the guiding principles, just to remind you all and put this in a greater context. Things to ask yourself when you're not sure whether what you're doing is ethical. Ask yourself, am I potentially harming the birds? Am I potentially harming the environment, or have I considered other people? So that's going to be the main spiel from me. I'm going to introduce our panel now, and I'm going to invite them to turn on their mics and videos as well. These are 3 friends of mine and 3 of South Africa's very prominent birders. And this panel was put together as a result of the social media thread, which I mentioned earlier. These were some of the 3 big contributors to this. And I think they have views that we could all benefit from hearing of. They're also very experienced birders. They've all guided in South Africa and abroad. And they have strong views, which I think we should hear. So Vincent Ward on your right-hand side is a tour leader for Birding Africa and Cape Town Pelagics. Vince is particularly passionate about seabirds and is one of the most active pelagic guides, as well as a volunteer rehabilitator at Sankob in Cape Town. Vince is one of South Africa's top listers, as shown by his lofty position on the South Africa Listers Club, and he is threatening Professor Peter Ryan in the race to be the first birder to see 800 species within the bounds of South Africa. Vince is also an active member of the Cape Bird Club and serves on their committee. Dr. Callan Cohen on your left-hand side is probably best known to most birders as the author of the very useful Southern African Bird Finder, one of the most informative and user-friendly resources for birders in the region. Callan is the co-founder and director of Birding Africa and Cape Town Pelagics and has guided extensively throughout Africa and abroad, putting his encyclopedic knowledge of everything from auks to orchids to good use. Callan holds a PhD from the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology and is still active in both birding and ornithological circles. Just this week, Callan has caused a stir in South African birding circles by discovering a putative green warbler, a potential first for Africa, not just South Africa. While this is bizarre enough as a discovery on its own, he managed to find this bird in his back garden in Scarborough, which is just ridiculous. Etienne Marais is a professional bird guide under the label of Etienne Marais Birding. Etienne is one of the most active birders in South Africa and regularly leads custom and set departure tours, birding workshops, and even guided twitches. Etienne is the only birder to have seen white or fairy tern in South Africa and is making a habit of finding new species in the region with a recent discovery of Forbes Watson Swifts in Mozambique. Etienne is also co-author of the Chamberlain's Guide to Birding Gauteng, a resource I've been making use of extensively since my move up from the Cape. Welcome everyone, and good evening to you all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we're going to get stuck into some of these discussions here. So I'd like to open up with a question to Vincent. Vince, this whole discussion is framed in terms of the South Africa Listers Club and whether or not we should allow herd-only records. And we're using this as a springboard for a wider discussion, of course, that we will get into. But I thought maybe let's ask you about herd-only records in South Africa, but also how they're treated more globally.
Thanks, Andrew. Since you sort of got a hold of me and asked me about this, I've had to do a lot of soul searching, sort of looking back as my history as a birder, considered how ethical I've been in the past, how ethical I consider myself now, and being a guide as well. There's that that added temptation to maybe push the bounds just a little bit when you have paying clients. And all of the conversations have sort of come down in my mind into three pillars, which I think are quite useful when we come to having any ethics conversation. And I think you've touched on a lot of these. A lot of these have been codified by the RSVP, the American Birding Association, BirdLife South Africa. And I think the common thread across all of these different organizations and within a South African context it comes down to three things. The first is how we behave as a birding community, how we interact with ourselves, and I know we'll be discussing that a bit later. The third one is how we perceived by wider civil society. We don't always go birding on our own property. The moment we pick up our binoculars, we're out there in the public. I was in Scarborough today, walking up and down the streets, looking for that green warbler, and we were looking into people's gardens, and plenty of birders have watched your How to Be a Birder thing, and we've come up as being the creepiest hobby out there. And I think every time we pick up binoculars, we do have a chance to interact with the public, interact with landowners, and to try and change the perception of us being voyeurs walking around neighborhoods with binoculars. And I think the most important thing is what you touched on, is how we interact with the environment in general and birds in particular. And I think the important thing is, a lot of this conversation is that we're dealing with life birds, we're dealing with our life lists. Most of the conversations I've had with people is the moment they've got the bird on their list, whether they're e-birding, doing surveys, doing bird lasser, herd onlys are perfectly fine. So I think the focus of this conversation is the issue about how we interact with that bird for the first time for those of us who do list. And going back to that issue of being a community, I was able to tap into friends in the US, in Australia, in Europe, and there's a wide sort of global approach, different birding traditions when it comes to this herd-only issue. A lot of what I'm going to talk about now are generalizations, very broad brush, and I'm not trying to sort of label any group as being sort of ardently on one side or the other. And the general sort of approaches I've heard is mainly that you got the British birding tradition and the colonies to which birding spread from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and they all seem to come down on you have to see a bird to count it. A lot of the comments I found on a lot of these forums where people have discussed what is called bird watching, not bird listening, and I think that sums up a lot of that approach. And when we had that Facebook conversation about listening and ticking, this comment about it's bird watching, not bird listening, that has come through as well. So I think that's an important part of the South African mindset. In the Americas, the main organization there is the American Birding Association. They are more than happy with herd-only birds. And a lot of that has come from this growing realization that birding isn't an impactless hobby. We go out there, we interact with birds, we change their behavior, we go into their habitats, we are imposing on them, and that has come into line with what BirdLife South Africa has realized and decided on as well, that that we are making that impact, and that herd-only birds may take some of that pressure off. Some of the other sorry, I'm just referring to my notes here. Some of the other sort of approaches are particularly in the tropical rainforests, in the tropics, where you have these birds that might occur in canopies, which are dozens of meters above you. There's very few chances that you're going to hear these things. So in that sort of birding, herd only is also perfectly acceptable. And sort of within Europe, once you stop speaking English and you move to the continent, particularly the Swedish and Finnish birders and Dutch birders as well, are perfectly happy with herd only birds as life birds. And the reasons for that, the motivations for that, seem to also come down on this issue of the impact on the bird, and that the other realization is that to identify a bird on call is as much a field craft, an important field craft, as it is identifying a bird from a field guide. Another interesting thing that came up was there seems to be this interesting demographic shift as well across a lot of these different birding cultures, and it seems to be there's a shift amongst younger birders to being happy to tick herd-only birds, and the reasons that seem to sort of that this is happening is a lot of these birders have grown up with cheap, accessible technology, which is something we'll touch on, smartphones, internet call databases like Zeno Canto. So you can learn calls, you can add it to your arsenal of bird identification skills, and that you can go out and you can pin these things down, you can interact with them on herd only, as opposed to physically having to see the bird.
Yeah, that's an interesting difference you picked up there with the demographical use. Now, I wonder, even when I was growing up, and I'm not that old, the only resources I had for birds were bird books. So being able to look at the birds and then seeing the birds in the books and then seeing the birds in nature, there was a connection there. And with this proliferation of sound technologies, I wonder if that's played into the role. And I just wanted to touch on another thing you said there about bird watching, not bird listening. Now, Etienne, I've heard you say before that it's not bird watching, it's birding, because we also listen to the birds. Do you want to just chime in there with your philosophy?
Yes. Well, when I was introduced to birding at the age of 7, way back, my mentor, Dr. Guy Berry, sternly said to me right at the beginning, young man, it's not bird watching, because listening is a huge proportion of birding. And for me, all my life, sound has been fundamental to birding. So it's definitely not bird watching. Bird watching is something people who non-birders would do.
Thanks for clarifying that. I also prefer the term birding, as I gave in my How to Be a Birder webinar as well. I just think it's a much sleeker and more all-encompassing term. Callan, before we came on, you were telling me around some of the motivations that the ABA, the American Birding Association, had for changing to herd onlys. I wonder if you just want to share that story briefly.
Yeah, I think they were in particular, I mean, the story might be a bit more complicated, but the version that I heard was that, in particular, and I think there's a number of things you flagged we're talking about later, that the sort of rise of competitive birding and, the need to you compare lists and to tick birds on lists. And they have a few especially secretive species such as black rail. And people were going to the area genuinely wanting to interact with this bird. But in order to sort of compare lists and bird in that nature, they needed to see the bird. And so they needed to, flush it out or use, a lot of playback in order to see it as an extremely secretive bird. And so I think they reasoned, a little bit like some of the discussions we've had around streaky-breasted flufftails and striped craigs, that, in terms of the impact on that bit of habitat, if people were able to sort of, tick the bird and put it on that call, that they could go there, appreciate the call and the habitat and not have to disturb it, and yet still get the same thing out of it in terms of, a tick on their list and, being able to sort of quantify that experience, which I think has been important to a lot of people.
Yeah. I think that it's important to always come back to that ethos of birding, and why are you birding? Are you putting your list above the welfare of the birds? And if so, that's not really in line with what BirdLife South Africa stands for, at least, and by proxy, the South Africa Listers Club. So, Etienne, I want to come to you and ask, we touched a little bit on how how needing a visual record or even in a more extreme case, a photographic record can have a negative impact on birds and their habitats. Can you just expand on that for us?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think the starting point is an understanding that as birders, we do have an impact on birds. You know, I don't think there's any form of birding that has zero impact. And I don't think we're sitting here trying to be on some pedestal as birders and guides who have no impact. We do have an impact. But I think the fundamental question is, how do we minimize our impact? How do we ensure that the way we bird has less of an impact? And from my, you know, the way I see it is that birding is getting bigger and bigger, and that's something to be celebrated. But if you have 500 birders in South Africa and they all need to see a button quail, and there's many sites, there might be 200 sites, then the impact on the button quail population might be quite minimal if every single one of 500 birders goes and walks through a grassland and flushes a button quail. But there's 20,000 and maybe 30,000 birders, and these birds are threatened. So there's a fundamental difference, I think, in the impact if everybody who's a birder needs to see every bird on the list. And I think, you know, let's just talk about some of the examples of where seeing a bird has more of an impact on the birds than just hearing it and listening to it. And I think there are many such examples. But from my experience, we look at species like the button quails, like the quails, and the rallards, which are often in wetlands, in grass. You know, birds like corncrake are usually seen, I think, as a standard by flushing them. African grass owl has been seen traditionally by going into those habitats in winter. I think there's a progression in our consciousness as guides and as birders. So if I look back 15 years ago, people would go looking for grass owls and they wouldn't pay much attention to season. Now we've moved on, and you know, I think guides will say, well, we'll go and show people grass owls, but we'll only do it in the non-breeding season. I think the next step for me personally, and that's something I actually discussed with one of my colleagues just this week, is to say, we just don't flush grass owls ever. We don't go looking for grass owls in their roosting habitat, because you can't go and look for a grass owl in its roosting habitat without disturbing the habitat. It's just impossible. And, you know, there's just too many birders, and this is just not sustainable. So, you know, I'd like to put right up front, I'm not some purist who's never flushed birds, who've never called up birds, etc. But if I take the example of a lot of other secretive birds, or if we move off birds that live in grassland or wetland type habitats, and we look at you know, forest birds, or as the case may be, I've just been doing a warbler weekend, and these birds tend to be elusive, secretive, hard to see, and it's simply a question of the pressure of needing to try and see them in a compressed amount of time. If we as birders had all the time in the world, we could sit and wait and we would eventually see all the birds, but that's just not realistic. The reality is everyone is birding under pressure of time. They're on a tour, they've only got a couple of days in each the types of habitat, and the pressure is we want to see them. So that's where I think the pressure comes in, with greater use of playback and moving more into the habitat instead of being sort of aloof from it. I think the pressure to see birds within a compressed period of time, you know, even goes so far as, well, let's drive there rather than walk there on a grassland. You know, and we've seen that debate in relation to Wakkerstroom. Recently, in relation to Gomo, there have been interactions about why are people driving over these plains when there might be breeding birds actually nesting right there. In fact, there was a famous or well-documented twitch at Barokalala for Pacific golden plover a couple of years ago, and people drove right to the site instead of walking it, and there were you know, there's factual evidence that nesting kittlets plovers had their nests destroyed by that process. Yeah. So in summary, I think to me it's very clear, all birding has an impact on the environment, on the birds' environment, and on the birds themselves. But the more you need to see every bird, and you know, nocturnal birds, secretive birds, birds which are difficult to see in particular. But I think even a bigger, you know, range of more common birds. if you need to get good views, and maybe we can come to photography, the pressure on those birds, the pressure on using tape playback, pressure on using more tape playback, more intrusive birding practices or techniques is there. And there's no doubt that giving birders the option of being more ethical and having less impact, because I think that's what BirdLife is doing here. They're saying, we want to encourage you as listers to have less of an impact, and particularly on birds where the disturbance, the disturbance of having to see it is particularly high and particularly threatening. And maybe out of this decision will come a discussion about which particular species would take priority in terms of saying, I'm going to tick these birds only on sound. So in summary, yeah, look, I think it's a great move forward. I think this is a moving debate. It's getting something that has been going on for years, the discussion. But I think it's reaching a point because of the growth of birding where we need to be more reflective and put the welfare of the birds right on top of the agenda as the number one thing we need to take care of when we go birding. And that means that definitely visual records should be, let's say, downgraded, or as a community, our ethos should be that it's less important to see every single bird.
Yeah, thanks for that lovely summary, Etienne. And I think it's important to echo that we four are no angels. We're not free of sin, as it were. We've all guided tours and we've all been out birding. We've done these things before, but it's we're also not the arbiters of what ethical birding is. We're just having a frank discussion amongst ourselves. But I think it's a lovely way you ended there, that all birding has an impact, but we just need to be cognizant of our own role that we play in that. And I'd like to just touch on playback, because I don't know that we're going to get back to it by the end of the discussion, or I'm sure there'll be questions about it in the question box. But I had Dr. Lucy Kemp of the Mabula Ground Hornbill Trust email me today and say she can't actually tune in tonight. She wanted to, but she wanted to just give me a little stat, which I found quite shocking, that for ground hornbills, which is not a bird that we would typically think would be very sensitive to playback, there's been anecdotal and kind of soft studies done on playback with these birds, which are heavily territorial, and up to 10 days these birds can keep coming back to the same spot to try and find this intruder that they couldn't locate. So if you think, a lot of birders say, well, I use a little bit of playback, the bird comes in and then it's fine, it just goes on with its life. But we don't necessarily know that. That's making a really big assumption. And I think there's strong evidence. Maybe it's just anecdotal at this stage, but Etienne, you and I were chatting. Someone needs to do a study on, these sites where playback has absolutely changed the behavior of the birds. They become either non-responsive or they've disappeared. So please, playback is a big issue and one of the driving factors behind this decision. I don't want to harp on about that.
Can I come in there?
Yes, you can come in. You can come in, Etienne. Please do.
Yeah, just I think that's a very important point, and I think all of us as guides have this experience that sites that are heavily used, for example, the example of cinnamon-breasted warbler covered in Callan's great book. Those sites are just, it's almost like the birds have been affected by the heavy birder attention in using playback or whatever else that goes on there. And what's current in wider Gauteng has been the massive amount of birding focus on Zarkeldrift and Khomo. And I can reflect, anecdotally over all the years I've been birding it for 25 years. There are just less birds along the road where all the birders are. And yet if you go off onto a farm 500 meters away from the road and you go birding there, it's like the good old days. There seem to be more birds, there seem to be more bird parties. And I just think that this should perhaps be a priority, the idea of doing some research to actually ascertain, much more clearly what is the impact of a heavy birder presence in a particular area, and the impact of tape playback. Because I think traditionally, there've been some people who say it has no impact, it's just a normal process, it's just a normal breeding course. Sorry, I hope I'm not getting into someone else's discussion. But I think the point here is that we need research to understand this process, to understand what happens. yeah, I'll leave it there for
Yeah.
now.
Thanks, Etienne. Yeah, I think if people have specific questions that they want to ask the people about the conservation ethos behind this decision and behind the whole ethics of birding, you're welcome to pop those in the Q&A box. I see there is a lively discussion in the chat box as well. Please do pop any questions in the Q&A box so we can get to them at the end. But I want to move away slightly from the conservation side of this decision and maybe explore some other motivations with Callan around why we may consider herd only as a legitimate experience of the bird.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, thanks, Andrew. I agree with a lot of the sentiments expressed already. So thanks for bringing them up. Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to say, well, you know, if trying to see the birds is going to disturb them, then don't be a competitive birder. But it's also another angle to take by saying, well, one way of just thinking about birds is thinking about them more, you know, just not the bird watching, but, you know, birding generally, and a bit about putting more emphasis on how we listen to birds and how we even just enjoy birding. And you can still, you know, keep lists and do twitches and all sorts of things, but one can still start to think a bit more about how one experiences birds. I mean, I can see on the questions and comments on the sides, I haven't read all of them, but you know, there's a blind birder who has commented, and I know some birders whose sight is extremely limited, and who focus a lot on the auditory sounds on bird calls. And you know, as somebody also mentioned, you know, we are primates. We do really like looking at things. Often, you know, sight is our first and most impressive sense. But actually, if you think about how much we use sound when we bird, we're probably undervaluing it. And I think when we say things like, well, you can only tick something if you've heard it, not only is that, you know, potentially an issue with disturbance, but it's also trying to say, well, you know, sight is more important than a sound. And that's simply not true. I mean, if you think about how often you go birding, if you're sitting at your desk birding or going for a walk, you're listening to things all the time, listening and listening and listening. And it's important not to, you know, downgrade how important that is. You know, a lot of birds have very characteristic calls. Things like fish eagles and emerald spotted wood dove create a tremendous sense of mood and atmosphere. You know, those sounds can be just as beautiful as seeing a lilac-breasted roller or a crimson-breasted shrike. And I think one should sort of embrace, you know, how amazing bird sounds are. And of course, some birds are extremely, you know, perhaps more eye-catching than their calls are. But it's also important to remember that a lot of birds are, in fact, often characterized by their calls, in fact, many ways more than their sounds. Like if you think of something like an Eisner warbler, I mean, it's got surely one of the most beautiful bird sounds in the world, with a sort of cascading series of whistles that sort of creates a wonderful forest ambiance. And the bird itself, not wanting to downgrade it, but, you know, it's extremely brown and extremely skulking. Looks very similar. There are many birds across Africa that look the same, or very similar, like Barrett's warbler and evergreen forest warbler, but each one has a completely distinctive song. And when you hear the song, you can tell instantly what that species is. And if you showed me now, if you just quickly showed me a photograph of an Eisner warbler and an evergreen forest warbler from Cameroon, I probably couldn't tell the difference. I mean, I've got plenty of experience with both of those birds. I've seen them multiple times. But I would be able to tell you how the call differs in an instant. And so in some ways, the call is so much more a part of those birds than seeing it. And I feel this instinct myself. I always want to see something. I feel a need to see something sometimes, but then sometimes I catch myself realizing that maybe I should actually just be appreciating the call more. You know, sometimes when I'm guiding tours and we hear this beautiful Eisner warbler calling, and the people are just extremely stressed and they don't enjoy the call because they're just waiting to see the bird. And then you see this little shadow move, just a shadow. It could even be a leaf falling, and it moves across. And then there's a sense of relief that suddenly the bird has been experienced and suddenly now counts. And it's made me realize that I've suffered from that a little bit myself. You know, I also want to see things, but I think I've found myself more and more thinking, well, actually, for some birds, the call is so much more than actually seeing the bird, and that we should, you know, really think about how we appreciate it. I know it's hard if we can't tick it. It's hard to put it in a category, and so when you have an experience, you can't record it and share it with your friends in that same sort of way. But I mean, I really think the BirdLife decision to allow ticking on call helps us sort of capture those those sounds. I think another thing that I've heard said is, and you touched on this, Andrew, is that, well, a sound is inherently an unreliable way of listening to a bird. Somehow if we see something, well then, that's reliable. But if it's a sound, it could just be a mimic. And I think part of this boils down to the fact that we're learning more and more about sounds every day. And as birders, we hone different parts of our birding skills at different times. Often we start with the more obvious colorful birds and water birds, and then we get to really difficult raptors, and then we get to learn our warblers. And the same is with sound. As we get to know sounds more and more, we can sort of appreciate, how to tell them apart. And once you get a sense of context on sounds, it's actually relatively easy to distinguish between mimics and non-mimics. I mean, it's not always the case. I was standing just in Southern Kruger, or just outside the gate in Southern Kruger in November last year, and I heard absolutely perfect African broadbill calling, and I couldn't believe that African broadbill in the Lowveld. And my birding friend with me, we both said it's incredible. And then we thought there must be something wrong, and then we waited a little bit, and then we could hear a Natal red-cap robin chat do a whole series of Natal coastal birds, but you could hear from the context that it was mimicking. So there's always a bit of context with mimicking. So I think the more we pay attention to sounds and sort of appreciate them, the more you can be sure that you're hearing the real thing. And just like with a sound, if you're not sure, you don't have to put it on your list. Just like if you see a raptor or a falcon shoot past, you don't really get a good enough view. You can still, opt to see it or opt to hear it better. I don't think it's necessary to always treat it as unreliable.
Yeah, thanks, Callan. That was a really nice summary of that. And I loved your example of, seeing hearing this warbler calling and calling and calling, and then you see it flit across the path, and then, yeah, you've got the bird. I mean, it actually, when you think about it that way, it is a little bit ridiculous. For that bird specifically, call was so much more of that experience. And something else you said just reminded me that I think we need to just tell everyone tonight, we're talking about very much ticking lifers and that kind of thing tonight. That's the context in which we framed this whole discussion. But this applies in your general birding life as well. It's not just well, now this is the second time I'm recording this bird, so now I'm going to charge in and go. It's about an approach. And I think you made a really lovely sentiment there of actually just sitting back and saying, well, wait, listen, let me just enjoy the ambiance and atmosphere that this bird is creating, and let me experience the bird that way. And I think it's a really nice way that we can adapt the way that we bird just on a regular basis. And I think you touched on some of those extra skills that you need. Well, the top birders that I've interacted with, I've been most impressed by their hearing skills, not really their sight skills. To get onto a birdie, generally, knowing their call is almost more important in locating it than knowing what it looks like. So it's an important skill that people should focus on some more. Etienne, I'm going to come back to you, and I know this is something you're passionate about, but I am cognizant of time. Just want you to touch briefly on the role of competition in birding and the competitive side that seems to have taken hold, not just in South Africa, but worldwide, with the advent of new technologies and people keeping in contact via social media, etc. How does a competitive attitude change birders' behavior?
Well, what's interesting to me is how birding has become, in your first talk, your earlier talk on how to be a birder, you talked about different birder profiles and different aspects, and it's something I've also spoken about. There's the side of someone which is just loving the beauty of nature. There's the whole experience of birding, and there's the let's say naturalist side, where you want to know more about the birds, how they function, what's going on in their lives, how they migrate across the planet, and all those kinds of things. And then there's this aspect of competition, and it seems to me, and I'm kind of going to put my neck out there and say that birding's become focused mainly on competition and on listing, as opposed to the other aspect. The other aspects, so if I can just put it in a nutshell, competitive listing is mainly about adding numbers to your list. This is perhaps a caricature, but adding numbers to your list, and then looking to see who else is close to you and whether you're ahead of them or not. And it's kind of, look, I've done it, and I've been part of the listing clubs and so on, for many, many years. But I've come to a point of thinking, what's really the point? And is that really what I want to do? Is it a priority in my life that I want to go off and chase a lost green warbler in Scarborough? As opposed to just having a fascinating discussion with Callan and Francie, which we can do on WhatsApp, about the amazing reasons why this bird might be there, the sonogram analysis, just learning about the green warbler and its habitat and its migratory patterns. It's a fascinating puzzle. So what's important? Is it important to go rushing off and get on a plane and fly down there and have a massive carbon footprint and then tick this bird on my list? Does that make Etienne Marais a better person or a better birder? I'm actually just not, I've reached a point where I'm just not that, it's just that not that important to me. And if I can give another example, just a related example, I take people on warbler weekends. I do the warbler boot camp, as some people call it. And the focus is on warblers. And everybody usually sends a list, which are the warblers they want to tick. And I had a discussion last night actually with a group, and I was actually talking aloud or thinking aloud. And I was saying there's a kind of poverty in going to study warblers and only being interested in putting them on your life list. Here are the most incredible birds, the most incredible migrants with very complex hormonal changes in their life that we're seeing right in front of us. We're seeing the warblers feeding up for the massive migration back to the Palearctic right before our eyes. It's an amazing opportunity. Just this morning, we had an incredible marsh warbler that was mimicking, 10, 11 South African species. I want to go back there tomorrow and listen to that marsh warbler and record it. But just to have marsh warblers of the LBJ on your list now, I've moved from, 642 to 643. Really? That's kind of like, is that really what birding is about? I think in a way, competitive listing is a detriment. And it's a detriment primarily to the people who are obsessed with it, because they're missing out on the headspace to actually explore more and learn more about these incredible creatures in front of us. So I'm speaking personally. I've reached a point in my life where I've decided almost I'm no longer going to list my total, because it's kind of, it's not really what drives me. If I can give one other example before I finish, I played a role in the discovery of the Upchurch warbler because I spotted something funny on Facebook and I thought, that's not a marsh warbler, it's a hippolay. And I got in touch with some people and it ended up being an Upchurch warbler that won a Tankatara. And I had the most amazing experience being part of all these discussions with local and international experts, listening to recordings, watching videos. I never left my house. I twitched that bird vicariously, and I still take a lot of pleasure for it. I don't need to go there myself and see it. I mean, for me it was a great excitement. So the competitive side, I think, also drives, just in summary, it drives the conquest versus time. So we've got to conquer more species in a shorter time, because we need to get these birds on our list. People set targets by January, by July. By the end of the year, I want to get 850 or whatever. And that's where the pressure for more, let's say, negative birder behavior in terms of whatever you do, whether it's walking through sensitive habitat, going on to places where you're not welcome necessarily, and the use and the excessive use of playback comes in. I think it does play a role, the competitive listing. So I'm going to finish it there. I'm sure the other panelists can add.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in before the other two. Just let me know if you want to jump in, guys. Yeah, I think, Etienne, you've shared your personal approach, and I think it is probably towards the one extreme on the spectrum. I would give a couple of balancing arguments there, that competitive birding, if you're competitive with yourself and you use it as a way to drive yourself to get out and go birding and explore new places and learn more about birds and the environment, it can be a very positive thing. But I think the competitive side that you mentioning is where the tick becomes more important than the bird, which I think is the ethos that we're trying to root out as a bit of a negative culture in South Africa. So thanks for bringing that up. And I also just want to mention that some of the different competitions or challenges, as we call them in South Africa, whether it's the wider Gauteng challenge or the South Africa list region challenge or wider Cape Town challenge, we've had a lengthy discussion when I was a birder in the Cape before I moved up, and we decided to include herd-only birds on that challenge years ago. And I don't know if that's been adopted up here in wider Gauteng, but for the same reasons. So I don't think it's a massive shift that we've really initiated here for the South Africa Listers Club. I think it's something that's well established and respected for the right reasons at a regional or at a sub-regional level. So it's just applying the same aspect to our birding ethos. And I think a lot about tonight is just getting people to be a bit introspective, think about the way they interact with birds in the environment, and maybe do a bit better. Other two, anything to weigh in before I move on?
I think with a lot of this discussion, I think there's a space for everyone. You can have those who are sort of ultra competitive. It doesn't mean that if you do belong to a listing club, then you should have that level. So with all of these listing clubs, you can sort of use it as a benchmark to see where you are in your birding career, and not necessarily have to use those top numbers as a driver. I mean, I personally don't sort of jump on a plane and go for every bird in South Africa. For me, my focus is mainly to see sort of how many birds I can see within Cape Town, and I think I'm sort of a middle ground between what Etienne has said about sort of appreciating the bird, and once you've seen something, going back, pulling out the big fat Robert 7, reading up, going back, looking at those things, and appreciating both the bird for the tick and for the science and the biology that is behind it. So I think there is a middle ground. We don't need to be completely dismissive of listing and being competitive. It's always fun to have a couple of mates and see how many birds you can atlas in a particular area in a year, or they're like the 150 challenges. I think we've made some amazing discoveries, particularly around the Cape. We're finding things that are sort of hadn't been discovered before. We're finding things like Cape Eagle Owls and some of the nightjars, something that we can then put on the conservation radar. So I think like I said earlier, there is a middle ground. We can sort of find a place for everyone under the general birding umbrella. And I think that's where these ethics conversations come in. That's how do we fit everybody under that umbrella, and still make sure we have birds left at the end of the day to see.
Thanks, Vince. And I apologize if I cut out there for a second. Our load shedding has just ended, so the generator switched over to electricity. So sorry if there was a break in communication. Vince, I just want to stay with you for a second. We're going to start winding.
Have we lost Andrew?
I think we lost Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I guess while we wait for him to come back, maybe I could just also give my thoughts on that. Well, I mean, from a personal point of view, I feel very much like Etienne. I love interacting with birds, even if I don't see them. Just just seeing pictures and hearing the discussion and becoming involved, I think is fantastic. As many of you will know, I don't list my total anywhere. I don't specifically have on the listing groups. But, having said that, I really do enjoy good competition. I've really enjoyed, Birding Big Day. And I really enjoy what the groups of people that do list very competitively are finding, some of the camaraderie that's coming out of it. And, a lot of the renewed interest in birding, I think, is fantastic. And in some ways has rejuvenated, some aspects of birding. And so I think, even though I get involved with that only to a very limited extent, and I do think I would certainly encourage it. And I think allowing those lists to, allowing calls to count on those lists is a good way, of encouraging and trying to sort of mix, the different objectives.
Is I think, look, I mean, just to go back to what I was saying, I was kind of taking an out there position, which is something I sometimes quite often feel. But
Yes.
certainly I'm still part of the Southern African annual list club, and I enjoy seeing how many birds I've had in Southern Africa. I enjoy seeing how many atlas cards I've submitted and all of that sort of thing. And I think there's definitely a place for, counting as something that is a game that adds to birding. And a lot of people come into birding like this. I just think we need to think of ways to put a bigger emphasis on really appreciating the actual birds. And there is a kind of an extreme end of the competitive listing spectrum, which is just literally tick the bird off, turn around and go away and go look for the next bird. And also that we try and tick those birds to get one more on our list at all costs, you know, in terms of doing whatever we can in a short space of time. And I think that is, in a sense, part of what drives the less, let's say I'm not going to say the worst behavior, but behavior which is has more of an impact on the birds than otherwise. I don't know if Andrew's back now.
He seems to be connecting.
We can maybe just carry on chatting while we're waiting for him.
Yeah. Do you feel like, I mean, something that we haven't quite touched on yet, but I think we were going to, is a bit about how, in particular, the need to get a photographic record of birds often feeds into that.
Yes, I think look, we're talking about a spectrum here, and you know, as I said in the beginning, all birding has some impact, and I think you know, if you look at it in a global sense, now that so many people are photographic ambitions, they want to try and photograph every bird they see. And I think there's the other element whereby people don't only just want to photograph, but they want a better photo. 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 And that often drives just much more pressure. And as a tour guide or a tour leader, generally your pressure from people who just want to see a bird and tick it off and are happy to just observe it is much less than your pressure from those who want to photograph the birds. And that is less than the pressure from those who want to be on the cover of National Geographic. And they want literally, they're never quite satisfied with what they've got. And it's always like, okay, well, more, you know, more. And you know, fundamentally, the question is, how many birders are there in the world? Do they want to photograph all of them? Want National Geographic photograph of every single bird? Is that even remotely sustainable? So for me, photography should be, and again, I'm putting my own personal perception here, it should be something you do when you have an opportunity. And it's great to have photographic records, and certainly photographic records are, you know, of incredible value in promoting birding and just showing beautiful birds, etc. And a major part of social media. But in a sense, we have to have a discussion about when is enough, and how much time and effort and disturbance goes into every photograph. So, I mean, just something off the wall here. How about a photographic list club where you only can show photos that you've used with 0 tape playback, and you have a list club, and let's get competitive about that.
Oh, yeah. A good case study, and something that's been quite close to my heart, and that myself and Callan, as being involved in Birding Africa, have got involved in, is the whole issue with Cape rock jumper, which is the bird of the year. And it got quite heated at Royal. So for people who haven't been there, the setup is, you've got the little town of Royal, and then you've got this beautiful coastal dirt track that leads between the town of Royal and Pringle Bay. And you sort of walk along there, and then you have this scree-covered feinbos slope on which there are probably 5 to 6 pairs of Cape rock jumpers. And they're the only almost sea level population of rock jumpers that are around. Mostly they're an alpine species, several hundred meters up, and usually in fairly difficult to get places. And when I was on the Cape Bird Club, and I started to receive all these emails from people about, do you know about the photographer who had walked up the slope and was sitting with speakers and was blaring calls during the breeding season? And once I started looking into it, I started speaking to people in the local conservancy. It was this major issue. And like I said, when we first started, you got the sort of 3 pillars, and with that central pillar being how we seen by the greater public at large. And there were lots of very ill feelings amongst people in Royals, and the sort of lots of grey areas. it was thought that that slope initially was public land, but it was in fact all private land. And there were landowners who were starting to get to the point that they wanted to put fences up across the road. It's a beautiful site that you can walk. There is no fence between the road and the slope, which allows the rock jumpers to get down to the roads at certain times of the year. And it was when we really started to delve into that you kind of realized that this whole area was a pressure cooker. And during our sort of non-COVID times, when we do day trips around the Cape, the rock jumper is always the sort of our best seller in terms of day trips. And there was a very real concern and a very real threat that the locals may have just said, okay, we've had enough of birders, we've had enough photographers, enough is enough, and we're going to close access to that site. So as Birding Africa, and I was also on the Cape Bird Club at the time, so wearing various hats, and we managed to sort of find a good middle ground with all the role sort of players at Royals. And the solution was putting up signs. Anybody who's been to the rock jumper site in the last year and a half will see those signs. We have them at all the major entrances, and then all the major sort of hotspots for rock jumpers along the way, spelling out how we think birders should behave, so that we can all sort of play nicely and keep everybody sort of in line, keep everybody happy. I think that's an important case study in birding and how birding behavior can go wrong, and how we can start to look quite bad in the public eye.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. And sorry everyone for chiming out for a second. It was the dreaded load shedding cutting back in. So Vince, I think that's a really nice case study for us to end on. Is an example where birds are being disturbed, sensitive habitat, threatened habitat is being disturbed, local landowners are unhappy, birders are behaving badly, and with some simple solutions in education, we can wake people up to the impacts of their birding on the environment and birds. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I know we have lots more to discuss, and we could have a whole nother webinar on this. I just want to say thanks to you three for tuning in and giving us your opinions. Again, these are all of our personal opinions. We're not the arbiters of what ethical birding is, but we have lots of experience and a vested interest in protecting South Africa's birds. So I hope everyone has found tonight very useful and informative. And I'm going to wrap it up there for our discussion. We do just have 15 minutes for questions, but gentlemen, while I cut out and had to log back in, Zoom erased all my questions. So what I'm going to do to facilitate this is allow each of you to scroll through the questions as they are in the question and answer box at the moment, pick out your favorite and answer it. So I'll let whoever finds their question to answer go first. If you guys can just chime in as you see something that you think is really worth discussing tonight.
I saw a question which I quite liked, and it was a follow-on from something I raised. It's now disappeared, sorry. Well, someone asked the question, how do you do photography in an ethical way, bird photography in an ethical way? And look, I mean, I'm certainly, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on bird photography, but I would say that if you go out with a camera and you're patient, and you minimize any kind of disturbance, and you wait for the opportunities to come your way, and you know, there are always opportunities. If you're out in nature, wherever you are, in whichever kind of habitat, there are great opportunities for photography. And you know, I think it's just a question of patience and not having this time pressure that you're saying, going to somewhere and you've got to get photographs of 10 species in a day. That's kind of the contradiction with photography. So yes, I mean, is there an ethical approach to bird photography? Yes, I think most definitely.
Yeah,
and perhaps, you know, yeah, that would be my answer.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. Have either of Vince or Callan found one that they'd like to address?
Yeah, I'd like to chime in about the one about fishing or fishing, depending on where you are in the world. I think that's a very important thing to touch on, and I think when we sort of had a lot of the discussions offline with regards to what's ethical birding and how how much of sort of changing the bird's behavior is enough. I think pitching is something that we should really think about, and we should use as conservatively as we do playback. One of the things that I bumped into, which I never even really thought of, and I think a lot of local birders wouldn't even consider controversial, is the whole issue of pointing. So in some parts of the world, if you're out and there's that bird in the tree and everybody sort of sticks a hand out and are pointing at that, that's actually frowned upon in some birding societies and some birding circles as well. And within the guiding sphere, the other big sort of controversy is the use of laser pointers as well. So I think a lot of the discussion was focusing on playback, but there are other ways that we can influence the bird's behavior that I think we need to think about, or think twice about using, whether it's pitching or using squeakers like they do in North America, using laser pointers. I saw there was something about using floodlights and owls and nightjars. So I think that, again, sort of get back to those guiding principles. Do we really need to be doing some of these things? And like Etienne said, just sort of using good field craft, maybe being a bit more patient. It might take a bit longer to get those birds, but we can sort of enjoy the ride while getting a good visual on some of these things.
Thanks, Vince. Yeah. Callan, how about you?
Well, I see a lot of the questions have disappeared, but I mean, one practical one caught my eye with regards to, recording birds' sounds. I mean, identifying birds by their sound. One of them was that the question is, what about the standardization in citizen science data like SABAP? If we're now talking about using recording birds on the basis of song, will we suddenly be noting more of these birds? And does this not make the standardization does this not introduce an error, or bias? But I actually think that, as far as I understand, citizen science has always allowed bird songs and calls to be recorded as important as bird sightings. I know when I've contributed to these projects, a lot of the birds that I record on an atlas card, for instance, are simply heard. And I think that has been a trend in the past too. So I don't think it actually changes the citizen science participation. It's more about competitive listing and how one can count birds on those lists.
Thanks for clearing that up, Callan. I think that was an important distinction to make. And certainly, using herd records helps to get data on scant species and rare species without disturbing them as well. So it's definitely a worthy inclusion in citizen science efforts. So I think we're pretty much coming to the end of our allotted time here, and I don't want to take up too much of the good people's evenings, but I do want to say thank you very much to you three for tuning in. My apologies for the technical difficulties on this side. If I could have avoided them, then I would. Unfortunately, I think we can all be quite sympathetic around the ESCOM situation. And I just wanted to bring everyone back in conclusion in saying to people out there, if you are out birding, just always keep those three guiding principles in mind. Number one, have you taken into consideration the birds, and are you potentially harming birds through your behaviors? Number two, are you potentially harming the environment, whether that's the exact context that you're in or the greater environment through, for example, driving off road? And the third one is, have you considered other people? And I specifically say people, not birders. Certainly considering other birders is important, but considering the wider communities, considering the landowners, considering the local people that stay there in the areas that you're birding in. Are you being kind and fair to them as well? So that concludes our webinar on ethical birding. It was a lively one, and I thank everyone for engaging in the chat box and in the Q&As. I'm really, really sorry we couldn't get to more of them. I think the four of us were very much engaged in our discussions, and we ran a little bit over. And then there was that faux pas with the questions being erased when I was kicked out of my own webinar, which unfortunately we can't deal with. But you are also welcome to pop those questions in the end of webinar survey, which will pop up as soon as you exit this webinar. Please do take the time to answer these. It's a really important feedback for myself and for BirdLife South Africa. and you can have your opportunity on commenting on our Birders Code of Ethics and our approach in this regard that we've discussed tonight. So thank you, gentlemen. Good evening to you. And if you have any closing comments, you're welcome to have them now.
Thanks very much. It's been great to chat, Andrew, and thanks, Vincent, Etienne, as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks to everyone at BirdLife, and thanks to Eskom, I guess.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a great discussion to be part of. And looking at the comments and the chat, there's a lot of great comments and some nice wisdom there as well. So thanks to everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to leave the Zoom room open for just a couple more minutes for you to pop in those chat room messages. Otherwise, it's good night from us.